this computer. Awesome. Wonderful. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to JWA's Quarantine Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I am so happy to be back with you tonight. Please say hi in the chat box. Make sure to chat to everyone so we can see who's in the room with us. We love to know who's here and where you're coming from. Also, throughout the conversation, please add your questions and comments to the chat and we'll bring them into our discussion. We are really delighted to be able to continue offering this program and growing this community. I also want to thank Judaism Unbound for their partnership. They help us with the live stream so other people can watch it on Facebook and can have closed captions there and all that good stuff. Before I introduce our featured author for this evening and we begin our conversation, I wanted to say a few words about JWA for those who may be new to us. We are a digital archive that expands the Jewish narrative by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We take an intersectional approach to Jewish history and culture because we believe that uncovering a more diverse story helps us understand the world we live in and create, hopefully, a better future. The Quarantine Book Talks are just one aspect of our work. I hope you will check out jwa.org to explore the full range of projects and resources that we offer. We are actually celebrating our 25th anniversary this year, and I hope you will consider joining us in just 2 weeks on Thursday, November 4th at this time for our virtual anniversary event, and info is in the chat for that. Okay, I am delighted to welcome our author for this evening, Vanessa Zoltan. Vanessa is the CEO of Not Sorry Productions, a feminist production company where she co-hosts podcasts including Harry Potter and the Sacred Text and Hot and Bothered. She founded Common Ground Pilgrimages, which uses secular texts like Jane Eyre as the central book on literary pilgrimages. And I so love that idea and can't wait to find out more and go on those. That sounds just up my alley. Vanessa was trained as a non-denominational chaplain at Harvard Divinity School and is the author of the book Praying with Jane Eyre, which we're discussing tonight. Welcome, Vanessa. So glad to have you with us.
I am so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I think we're going to start with you sharing a little bit, a little taste of your book, and we can jump into conversation after that. Great.
So this is from the first part of my spiritual autobiography, which is how I start my book. I feel like it's very self-explanatory. I'm just going to be reading a few pages, so bear with me. My childhood was filled with Jews. Almost everyone I knew was Jewish. We mostly spent time with family, extended family who all hate each other now and probably hated each other back then too. Immigrant Jews, American Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews whose visits meant that I had to wear long sleeves even on the hottest of San Fernando Valley days. Atheist Jews, a Jew who survived Auschwitz and then converted to Catholicism and sterilized her daughter. Jews who weren't directly impacted by the war, but who used the war to argue fervently in defense of a Jewish state. And those are just the Jews I met at my grandparents' kitchen table. My family would go over to non-Jewish friends' houses for dinners or parties sometimes, but not often. When we did, in the car on the way home, my parents would always play the same game. They'd debate. Would those friends who just fed us, accepted our flowers, laughed with us, and hugged us goodbye hide us from the Nazis if the Nazis came to the streets of Los Angeles tomorrow, March 3rd, 1989? When we were really young, my brothers and I would just sit in the backseat of the car and listen to my parents dissect different data points. Was the fact that our friend had a living room that they never used symbolic of their ability to be organized enough to hide us successfully? Or was it a sign of rule following that would mean that they would turn us in? It happened to be more art than science, but usually my folks came to the conclusion that the woman would save us if it was only up to her, but the man would turn us in, overriding his wife. As I got older, I would argue with my parents. I sat in the middle seat in the back, and so would lean forward to be part of the adult conversations, while my brothers mostly stayed quiet, being of much sweeter dispositions than I. I went through a phase in which I insisted that everyone would save us. I defended colleagues of my dad's and soccer team parents of my brother's friends alike. Of course they would hide us. Then, as I got older still, I mostly agreed with my parents' assessments. I would offer my own deadpan answers to the question if I happened to disagree. And often I would defend these poor Gentiles. They have 2 small kids, I would point out. It would be reckless of them to hide us. I wouldn't hide us if I were them either. I said this truthfully, and yet without true consideration. My parents, sanely or neurotically, lived in acute fear of their children's survival in middle-class Los Angeles, California in the 1980s and 90s. And their concerns had nothing to do with the Northridge earthquake, the Malibu mudslides, the fire that evacuated me from the 3rd grade that we did not have a carpool plan for, or the brutal beating of Rodney King, his unjust trial, and its aftermath. They found my obsessive concern over California breaking off and floating away age appropriate, and my proposed solution to move across the border to Oregon adorable. As I attended private schools, lived in gated communities, took karate, got bat mitzvahed, and had swim practice, my parents wanted to make sure that we knew that we weren't really safe because we were Jews. Jews have felt safe before. They even felt safe for more than 100 years in some times and places, but they were never really safe. My parents came by this outlook pretty fairly. My father escaped Hungary in 1956 via the Jewish resettlement efforts that wound their way into Austria. My mom was born in a Paris that had been occupied by the Nazis 6 years prior. And even though my mother was born in France, completely legally, she's not a French citizen. They will not grant her citizenship because she was born there as a Jewish World War II refugee. Her Judaism keeps her from having a home country because she was a Jew exploiting a moment of French weakness. And then there were her parents. I am the grandchild of 4 Holocaust survivors. Literally, all 4 of my grandparents spent time in Auschwitz. My mom's parents met in Auschwitz. I met my partner online. So for my parents, this question of who would hide us was not an academic one. They were trying to teach us. They were modeling for us that picking friends wasn't just about laughing around a table. It was a question of life and death. And it was a question of life and death for both parties. Aren't I fun?
I know it's a heavy beginning. And part of what I love about your book is that you root it so much in your own story, and your story is rooted so much in the history that you carry. And then you bring that to these texts that are completely outside of that story. And one of the things that you say in that spiritual autobiography, actually close to that section, is that in some ways the Holocaust was your nationality. And I'm curious about that in the context of a spiritual autobiography, sort of how you saw that the Holocaust as your nationality is then related to your kind of spiritual life.
I mean, I think that everywhere we are from ends up being part of our spiritual life, right? We, in the United States, no matter whether or not you are Christian, right? You have Christian holidays off, right? You have this idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, which is a Calvinistic idea about predestination. I think our nationalities and our theologies overlap in a lot of ways, and I'm very American in a lot of ways, even in the ways that we have to deprogram ourselves from those nationalities. But so my nationality being the Holocaust more than any sort of home country is insofar as it was really the culture I was raised in. All of our theology was not based out of Judaism, but it was Holocaust theology. It was, what would you save? What would you take with you? Don't stand in line. Jews have stood in line long enough. We definitely followed some like halacha and some Jewish laws, but so many of the laws were really based on lessons learned from the Holocaust.
you describe yourself also in the beginning of your book as you're, kind of placing yourself and labeling yourself in certain ways. You call yourself an atheist Jew using fiction as scripture. And it's such a rich, and I was very impressed by your ability to very succinctly kind of name yourself and your project. There's so much to unpack there. So tell us a little bit about what that identity means to you.
Yeah, I'll go word by word. So I'm a very proud atheist. I feel like I get a lot of sense of power from atheism. I went to divinity school. I love spirituality and God language. It's just not language that works for me. And actually, what works better for me, what makes me feel more of a sense of urgency on this earth, is not believing in God, is believing that it is our responsibility to make this earth as just as possible, because there's no divine intervention, there's no deus ex machina. And really the place where God language stops working for me is in contemplation of the afterlife. That is when I'm like, no, I don't want to talk about the afterlife. I'm acutely worried about the suffering of the people in this world. And I also just think that often religion is not inclusive in its scope. And often the most vulnerable people get excluded from traditional religion. And obviously there are so many Jewish communities and other communities that try to be radically inclusive, like JWA. But I'm just interested in being on the margins of where people are excluded. And then Jewish, because 3 pages later, I talk about all the ways and reasons I'm Jewish. I love being Jewish. My Judaism is very important to me. Call my parents every Friday night to wish them a good Shabbos, and follow the Jewish holidays, and Jewish concepts and ideas really ground me in grieving rituals and thinking about my vegetarianism and kashrut. And I have a great fondness and love for my Judaism. And then, literature is scripture, fiction is my scripture. It's the closest thing to a transcendent experience, to the experience of feeling seen and loved by someone who could not possibly have imagined me, is through literature. And the example that I talk about in my book is with the book Caddy Woodlawn, which was my favorite book in the 4th grade. And I felt as though, it was written over 100 years before I was born by a woman from Kansas who definitely never thought that a Jewish girl in LA would be reading this book 100 years later. And it's a conversation between she and her father really seeing the way that she is self-conscious and feels like she's not a good person. And I felt like this man was talking to me, this character, and seeing me. And it gave me such comfort to think that this woman who lived 100 years ago had the same innermost thought that I had never been able to articulate to anybody, even if I had felt strong and vulnerable enough to articulate that. And that just, to me, has to feel similar to God's love, to feeling like there are these people out there who have these same thoughts and feelings, who we will never know each other, and yet they can completely touch my heart.
That's a really beautiful way of thinking about that kind of transcendent love as being transcending time and transcending people who don't know each other, but create those kinds of bonds. And I think it's interesting how you use the kind of metaphors and language, and you do throughout the book also talk about the importance of prayer to you, even if you're not praying to a divine being in the way that God is often conceived of.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in prayer. I think there are studies that T.M. Lorman wrote a great book about the studies that the way prayer works on our brains. And, this is like meditation, mindfulness, all of these things. There are brain mapping studies for it. But also just moments of contemplation. I'll speak only for myself, but my first thoughts, my first reactions to things are not my most generous reactions to things. My kindest, right? Like I can be very petty and not proud of what my first thoughts are. But my second thoughts are often much more gracious. They're more measured. And the thing that gets me from a first thought to a second thought is a form of prayer, right? It's asking myself what wise texts would tell me to do. It is like deep contemplation about the values that I want to live up to. And that is a prayer life to me. And I think that, I think that many of our mistakes could be fixed with prayer and by going back and saying, actually, I'd like to submit my second thought.
So what does it mean to you to make reading into a sacred practice? Like, why fiction as sacred? And I guess to get at that, like, what does sacredness mean to you to begin with? Which I think you're beginning to answer with your, some of your reflections on prayer even. But how do you think about what sacredness is and where it inheres?
So the way that we think about it with all of our projects is that sacred is an act and not a thing. And obviously that is like within the way that I practice with sacred texts. I know and respect people who believe that there are sacred objects, right? That there are divinely inspired books and piece artifacts. But what we say is that having faith, acting with rigor, and then in community are the three things that you need in order to treat something as if it was sacred. And so it's very much a conscious decision, this as if, right? It's similar to wedding vows, right? Like we are going to behave as if we know what the rest of our lives are going to entail and behave as if and make that commitment now, right? It's a similar relationship with a text. And so what we mean by faith is just the belief that the more time you spend with it, the more gifts it will give you, that there isn't a moment of time with it that is wasted. And I would say that's similar to the way that many of us feel about our children or being in a museum or in the forest, right? You don't have to know exactly what you're getting out of a painting. You might even be like, I'm not sure I like that painting. And yet we sort of believe on some level that it's working on us in some important way. And so even when the text is betraying you or confusing you or frustrating you, I think even then, the belief that it is a gift. And then rigor. So, whatever that means, if it's, Mary Gordon, one of my favorite novelists, she reads Proust for 5 minutes every morning. And she does that 7 days a week and has been doing it for years. Whether that is, I have a podcast about Harry Potter and we have 80 local groups that meet once a week and read a chapter of Harry Potter and talk about it. So just having like a deep commitment to go back to a text again and again. And I think that a lot of people do this already, like without any instruction. They fall asleep listening to their favorite book every night or whatever it is. Read Winnie the Pooh on the anniversary of their parents' death, right? We all have these relationships. So the third thing that we say is community. And the reason for community is that, right, like the same reason you have a gym buddy, the same reason that, you want a minion, right? I mean, it's really just, you don't want to be fundamentalist in your beliefs. You want to be pushed to go deeper, to work harder. And so we say that if you can, to find a reading buddy to do this work with you, that you will get more out of it. But it's really, to me, it's about the commitment and the choosingness of it, right? The naming of it. It's like asking a book to go study with you. I think is important. Oh, I can't.
So does any text work or does it, probably not any text works for any person, but does any text work for the right person who's chosen it?
So I definitely think that you should pick a text that you already love. I think that having an in-depth sacred relationship with a book, like a marriage, is long and difficult. And so you might as well do it with someone who you already like or a book you already like. What we say is just that it has to be generative for you. So it has to be complicated. And a book like Harry Potter works for a lot of people because, and that's evidenced in the fact that there's fan fiction and art and all of these things that come out of that universe that really moves people. And I think that that is a really good measure for whether or not a book is going to work for you. Are you imagining what's happening off the page? Can you and I both look at the same text and disagree about what it means? It has to be complicated and generative in that way. So like IKEA catalogs, not ideal.
And how would you describe the way that a sacred reading of a text is different than just a close analytical reading? Because many of us, I think, are trained to really go deep into text and to take text very seriously. But that, maybe in a more of a scholarly way, but how would you distinguish that relationship or that process?
Yeah, I mean, it's a prepositions answer, which is, you're trying to learn from it and not about it. So, and really letting the text speak to your life and asking the text questions. I do chaplaincy with about 20 women monthly, and we talk for about 15 minutes, and then we do scriptural analysis, but like spiritual scripture analysis with snippets of the text that they bring to our conversations. And it's amazing how much the text will speak to their lives. And so it's really just asking a text to speak to you and leaving yourself open to that it can actually draw you to something and teach you about yourself.
So Susan was asking, would you consider Torah study, which she does every Saturday morning, as sacred text or a different kind of text study? But it sounds like from what you're saying that it doesn't have to be what is considered a sacred text like Torah. It could be any text, but if you approach it as sacred text study, it is sacred text study.
Absolutely. And I would also say with Torah, you might be studying a sacred text, but it might not be sacred reading. If you are studying, you can study it academically, right? Look at what the lambskin that it was on, the typeface, right? You can be trying to learn about the Torah rather than from it and letting it speak to your life. But yes, if you are trying to glean lessons from your life, from the Torah for your life, that is the way that I would think about it.
So let's move this from the abstract and talk a little bit about how did you come to this kind of practice? Talk about how you began developing this schema, which now, as you've been talking about it as sort of that you have like a whole team of people that you work with in creating ongoing discussions about sacred texts, like about Harry Potter on your podcast, or about other, on all your podcasts, taking different kinds of texts and treating them with this approach. So tell us about how you arrived at this approach.
Such a good question. And I wish I had like a 30-second great answer. I was in divinity school and I was halfway through and I was really getting anxious about the fact I was about to do my first clinical pastoral education. So actually work as a chaplain in a hospital. And I was like, I don't know how to pray. I still haven't learned how to pray. And I kept going to temple and because I love going to temple, and I just kept getting distracted. I would hear the Shema and I would imagine my family in the gas chambers reciting the Shema right before they died. And I could never get through a service without picturing one of the most profane places that have ever existed on earth. And then I went to see a professor of mine give a talk at a church. I just sort of went to be supportive of her. And she was preaching on the Song of Psalms. And she was preaching on one of my favorite lines in the Bible of love is stronger than death. And I was sitting there and I was like, I really love that line. That line reminds me of Jane Eyre. And I was like, oh, Jane Eyre, that is a book that I love and that I only have positive feelings toward. that I like, it will never remind me of the gas chamber, right? That was my idea. And so that was my thought. And I went to this professor, Stephanie Paulsell, and I said, can you teach me how to pray using Jane Eyre? Jane Eyre is like safe. There'll be no problems with this. And she said yes. And so we spent 6 months reading Jane Eyre as sacred and trying to decipher what it meant to treat a secular text as if it was sacred, and what theological precedent is there for this, an academic precedent. And of course, it immediately became clear that Jane Eyre is an incredibly problematic novel that I, as someone who had read it twice and loved it, had not paid keen attention toward. But it didn't hit my like trauma buttons. It felt problematic and troublesome in ways that were exciting and interesting and heartbreaking, but not, just not traumatizing for me. I could get past it and keep engaging rather than pull away. And so that was really it. And then that summer, I walked around the hospital that I was doing my clinical pastoral education with, and I carried Jane Eyre with me, not because I was like going to preach from it, but it was sort of, you have a lot of downtime as a chaplain, and just the book I was carrying with me. And it was amazing how much of a conversation starter it was with people, mostly people who didn't like Jane Eyre, but would say, oh, you're a priest and you're carrying around Jane Eyre. And, I'd have to be like, oh, I'm not a priest. And it was just a way in to say to people, well, this is my sacred text. What's sacred to you? And it was baseball and art. And I just had these incredible, really expansive conversations with people by saying to them, like, this is actually my sacred text. And yeah, we've been doing this kind of work ever since. My friend Casper came to a group that I was leading, treating Jane Eyre as sacred. And he sort of now famously said, Vanessa, this is really cool what you're doing, but I think you should do it with a book people actually want to read, which was rude. And so we started doing it with Harry Potter. And now we treat a lot of different texts as sacred in a lot of different ways.
Linda has an interesting question about, like, if you pick a book that you already love, how do you get to the point of being able to see beyond your kind of initial, like you're saying, that sort of initial sense that you have only positive feelings, and get sort of deeper below that?
Well, I definitely think community will always help you with that. You are going to find different things problematic. And I also just think, if you're reading with asking it to teach you, it's going to fail you and disappoint you. And you're going to have to ask it why. It will rise to meet you a lot of the time. But even when it's failing you, you are learning something about the text, from the text, and about yourself. And so I think that, more intimacy with the text, going back, I outline in my book 5 different sacred reading practices. There are like really old spiritual technologies, mostly that Christians stole from Jews, so mostly Jewish. Spiritual technologies that walk you through the process that really are about critical reading, including, chavruta, like 2 people sitting. And that practice is based around asking difficult questions of the text. So I think that there are just a lot of cornerstones that you can stick your heels in to do that work.
Tell us a little bit, you write in the book about that kind of moment where you felt betrayed by the text of Jane Eyre, and how you were able to kind of come back to the process.
Yeah. So I don't know why, like, it never occurred to me, for those of you who have read Jane Eyre, you can judge me for being stupid, but like, I always felt there's a huge twist in Jane Eyre, 200 years old, so I'm going to spoil it for you all.
I think you can spoil Jane Eyre.
I can spoil it. So there's a huge twist that there's a mad woman locked up in the attic, and that it's Bertha, and that she is the hero's wife, and he was about to marry Jane even though Bertha's still alive. And I just always fell for it as like a Gothic trope and really enjoyed the plot of it. And then, reading it for the 3rd time, I was like, oh my God, right? Like, this is deeply screwed up. I sort of bought the justifications that Rochester offers, that if she'd been locked up in asylum, it would have been worse, and that, he tried to do right by her, and made all the excuses of like, oh, for his time, he was actually pretty good. And it's just like not true. And even if it is true, it's horrifying. The idea of locking up your wife for 10 years, occasionally putting her in a straitjacket and trying to marry the governess. And so reading it, believing that it would teach me things, I suddenly panicked. I was like, oh my God, am I letting it teach me horrible things? And I was actually at the point where I was reading it with other people. So I was like, did I lead them down this horrible path? And then I remembered that if I'm saying that sacred is an act, not a thing, it's the behaving as if, right? It is my relationship to the text that is sacred. It's not the book itself. And nor is believing that something is sacred, believing that it's perfect, right? And so decoupling those things, I'm not worshiping the text. I'm using the text as a way to practice love so that I can get better at loving my neighbor and my mother and my partner and my enemy. I am not, building a shrine to Jane Eyre.
You had this great line where you talk about, or I mean, it's not a line. One of the things that you're saying about the purpose of reading a text in a, approaching it as a sacred text is that you say that the point of treating any text as sacred is to learn how to treat one another as sacred, which seems very aspirational, since we know there are plenty of people who take their sacred texts very seriously and yet use them as actually weapons against other people. But so how do you see, can you say a little bit more about kind of that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, treating something as sacred is an act of patience and faith. And, St. Augustine would say that, like, if you're reading the Bible and the message you're getting is God is love, then you are reading it successfully. And if you're getting any other message, you essentially have to keep reading. And that to me rings true, that you have to fight to read that message, that God is love, and that there is that no one is profane. The more time you spend with anyone, the more gifts it will give you, right? That hate is about annihilation, and therefore love is just about believing the dignity and the right to exist of something else. And therefore practicing with something as low stakes as a book seems like a great baby step for treating your annoying neighbor as sacred. Jane Eyre disappoints me, and then my neighbor likes to mow his lawn at 7 a.m. on Saturdays, right? And it's just this moment of, okay, I've made this commitment to try to have faith that there is goodness, even in the most disappointing moments of my favorite texts, and even in my neighbor. But I think, right, Simone Weil, the French Jewish philosopher, said that faith is the indispensable thing, but also that attention is the indispensable thing, and that practicing attention is actually practicing love. That to pay attention to something is necessarily to love it. You can't truly witness something and not end up loving it. And I think that treating a text as sacred is practicing that kind of attention.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about sort of figuring out how to train that attention on a text, on a relationship with a text, which is not a person. It has different kinds of depth to it, but and then figuring out how you practice those muscles for people too, and making that shift. But I guess I always think about part of the reason why I love literature is that it feels like a doorway into humanity in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about the text as that kind of entryway to engage with the characters in it as people, then I can see how that transfers to actual people.
I mean, Virginia Woolf said that, a practicing imagination is an act of anti-violence. That if we were able to imagine an inner life for our enemy, we would never be able to shoot them. And she was talking about this after World War I, and what she's describing is not empathy. right? It's actually erasing the other's real story. If I were just to imagine things about you, Judith, right? Like I wouldn't be able to do violence on you because I'd be like, oh, she's a daughter, she has a job, but like I don't know you well. So I'm making up a lot of things. And so it's not an intimacy, it's just an imagination that you are a whole person, just like I am. And therefore, right, like I can't do violence upon you. And I think that novels force us to work those imagination muscles so that we can imagine more than our own experiences onto someone else, right? So you see someone misbehaving at the CVS, and you've read a novel where someone's had a bad day and has an outburst. And that's just something that's easier for you to imagine so that you can have more empathy. So I think, yeah, imagination is a muscle like anything else, and reading exercises that muscle. And I agree with Wolf that imagination can be an active anti-violence.
I love that. We have a question about, can you give an example of a particular passage from Jane Eyre and how you would approach it as a sacred text?
Yes. So my book is a collection of sermons using bits of Jane Eyre as sacred and then expounding upon them. So I'm recording an episode of one of our podcasts tomorrow, and we're going to talk about the line, laws and principles are not, I'm worried I'm going to mess it up. But laws and principles are not for moments in which we want to adhere to them. They're for moments such like these, when our body and soul rise in mutiny against them. And I don't know. So Jane is trying to decide, Rochester has said to her, look, yes, I'm married, run away with me anyway. And she's trying to decide because she wants to run away with him. He's offering her a house in the south of France. Like, it sounds like a pretty great deal. He's the man she loves. And this is her inner monologue saying, look, I have laws. There are laws and I have principles, and it's easy to live by them on a day-to-day basis. I actually don't even have to make choices to live by them. The world is set up for me to live by them. But now I'm being confronted with this opportunity. And what do? I want to violate my laws and principles, but this is when they're the most important. They're the most important when I want to violate them, because obviously and the quote ends with her saying, moments for such like this, when I am insane, I'm quite insane, right? That if she wants to break every law and principle she's ever had, she must be insane. And I have spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I think that sometimes that's true, that when we are in a moment of crisis, the best thing to do is say, what would I have done 10 minutes ago? What would I have thought 10 minutes ago prior to this new piece of information coming into my life? But I think other times emergencies happen and you suddenly have an onslaught of new information, and you should not behave according to your previous laws and principles, right? To be myself about it, right? Like, everything about what happened with the Holocaust was legal, right? And people were following their principles. I was just following orders. And so there's something that I love about Jane of saying, look, my principles apply now too. I believe in giving until it hurts. And, this will hurt a little bit more than I ideally would want it to, but that's the principle I'm sticking to. Or I believe in giving until it hurts, but the way it'll hurt right now is that it will take money away from my children, and that's actually not something I feel comfortable with, right? And so I think thinking about this sentence and the moments in which it's important to stick to your previous principles, and moments in which you're like, principles are out the window, we're in a different time now. When I'm confronted with moments like that, which I feel like we could all really relate to in COVID. There was a moment my dad needed surgery in the middle of COVID, pre-vaccine, and I could not figure out what to do to get on the plane or not. That my parents live in California, I live in Boston. And I was like, I might be risking their lives if I go, but if I don't go, my dad could die and I could not be there, right? And like, I'm someone, my previous principles are you show up. That's like one of the things you do in Judaism, minyan, you show up. One of the responsibilities. I was like, but I can't stick to my previous laws and principles. We're in the middle of a pandemic. And really wrestling with that question of, is this a moment where I stick with my old morals that I've always thought about, or do I switch to something new?
What I love about that example too is like it really shows how you can take something which is about, you can take a piece of text and in some ways you're taking it out of its Jane Eyre context and you're kind of riffing off of it to be like, what are the lessons that I need to, what are the challenges of being a person in the world and the questions that come up, and how do I explore that in some way that is rooted in a text that I trust in some way that will allow me to kind of play with it and feel like you're playing with it, not sort of up here, but like looking at it in a particular context.
Yeah. And it's not even necessarily that you trust the text, it's that you know it, right? And just so it gives you something to bounce off of, right? It's like a Rorschach test. It's not that, Jane Eyre, like taken out of context, she says some wild things that I disagree with. She says, the more friendless I am, the more I'll respect myself. It's like, that's some like Christian nonsense. Like, I want no part of that martyrdom crap. But just having access to that line and knowing it so well and knowing the context of when she says it, and that 100 pages later, after she has suffered alone, she says, I would rather be happy than dignified, and has changed. Like, I think that they just give us a triangular, right? I mean, it's why we do text study. It's to bend over something in order to respond to it. And so the more intimacy you have with the text, the better it's more ready for you to think with.
Right. It's sort of more accessible as a tool or something.
Exactly.
So you, in passing, just now kind of referred to your book as a collection of sermons. So tell us what you mean by sermons and why you frame them that way.
Yeah, I'm trying to share like the best news I can, which is like a Christian definition of a sermon, but I think that often rabbis preach from a similar point of view. I pick my snippets of text and then analyze them, but I'm analyzing them toward the idea of trying to get us all to be more loving. And so it is not like an unbiased essay analysis of like, this is what this really means. This is what it's based on from Charlotte Bronte's own life. This is the cultural reference. I'm trying to tell you the most essential lesson that I can glean to try to make us all more loving from this piece of text. And so really it's all of them have a spiritual agenda is really what it is. Yeah, they are in no way objective.
To go back to what we were talking about before, I just want to address a question that came up here, which is that I think some people in the room would like to know whether you went to visit your father or not, because they don't want to be left hanging with a cliffhanger.
I did not. I didn't for that trip. I went home a couple of times. My dad had to have, my mom is here, she'll correct me, I think 3 brain surgeries during quarantine. And I went home for 2 of them. But the trip I didn't go home was the hardest. And one of the times I went home, I didn't see either of my parents. My mom had to stay in the hospital with my dad, and I stayed in their bed. Like, there was just something about needing to be in the same city as them.
Right.
So I was zero help. I was probably just in the way. I did grocery shopping for my mom. So maybe that was helpful. But no, that trip, it was, I think, maybe the most miserable I've ever been in my life, but I decided to not go.
Yeah, this is a time of a lot of very unclear decisions and rules. We don't know what the rules are. No one knows what the rules are. We're constantly.
Yeah, it was about a year ago. Like just, whew, it's hard, right?
Yeah. But it sounds like, in some ways, I think I can hear from what you're saying, just showing up, even if you're not actually there, there's some kind of presence. And I feel like that speaks to your work also as a chaplain, right? That part of what it's about is just sitting with people. And in this case, you were sitting near, it just meant that psychologically your parents knew you were nearby, which is a certain kind of presence.
Yeah, I don't know if it did anything for them. I I knew that I couldn't stand to not be there, right? Which is often my barometer for things. It's like, if I can't, what can I not stand? Let me do the opposite. And so regardless, I justified that I was helpful. I walked the dog, you know,
Yeah.
I like cleaned the kitchen, but I just couldn't not be there.
Well, we're not evaluating your decision. I
Okay.
just wanted to, but I think it gets at that question, which some people may have about like, what does it mean to be an atheist chaplain?
Yeah, it's really so chaplaincy I wanted to be a hospital chaplain or a prison chaplain. And I practiced chaplaincy in both of those settings, and other things got too busy, so I haven't been able to go back to that for a little while, although I hope to. But those chaplaincies are really just about holding space for people in moments of crisis. They're very different than congregational work where you have relationships with people over years. These are very short-lived transactional relationships. And it's just about holding space, and like selfishly, it's just about bearing witness. Um, the most acute story that I can tell is much more dramatic than what it was usually like as a hospital chaplain. But I worked in an ALS clinic on Wednesdays. And mostly it was an amazing clinic at Cedar Sinai Medical Center in LA that the patients come for the day and they stay in one room all day, and the doctors and therapists all go in and out. And so you can have like 12 appointments with all of your specialists in one day, because mobility is obviously an issue with ALS. And people therefore would fly in from Seattle and Hawaii, from all over the West to go to this clinic, because you only had to go every 3 to 6 months. And I would hang out in the hallway. And when a patient's door was open, there wasn't a doctor in, I'd sort of poke my head in and be like, hey, you want company? And just talk to people. And very rarely in a hospital does someone yell, chaplain, like emergency. But somebody did. A doctor came out and said, chaplain, we need you. And I came in, and this woman was having a panic attack. And I held her hand, and the doctors came back in, and I was ushered out, and they gave her a shot, some sort of sedative shot. And she had just gotten diagnosed with ALS and was having a panic attack. And literally my whole job was to hold her hand for the like 10 seconds that it took for them to get her a shot. And that's it. That's like all it is. And that's what my chaplaincy sessions with people are. It's like just sitting with them as they think things through, and being a loving presence, and a non-judgmental person to listen to them. A lot of the chaplaincy that I do, I sit down and ask people, what question do you want to talk about? And they'll say, should I quit my job? And I will literally say back to them, should I quit my job? Should you quit your job? And just listen to them and point out patterns that I've, heard them say multiple times. But it's really just about being a loving presence. It's a really fun job, just listening to people.
But listening to people in hard times, I could see how it could also be there. You'd be holding a lot of pain and loss.
Yeah, but there's nothing you can do. And there's something, it's like, it's obviously not easy to see people be in pain. You also just get to be up close to life, right?
Mhm.
Like, I've done weddings and funerals and baby namings, and something really fun about having a front seat to all of that.
Right.
Chaplains are just voyeurs. Like, that's all we are.
But
We just want the good seats.
I think it connects to sort of like seeking the sacred, right? Like it's the most real that people are. And so you're there at the heart of what's most real in life. And so that, I think, is probably where the sacred runs through, even if you're talking about things that might seem distant from that. It's sort of, it's core in some way.
Yeah. You're watching people have realizations. Yeah, it's I'm just realizing I love going to the theater. And I'm like, and now I just treat life like a theater. I'm like, I just always want the front row seat and be like, ooh, you're getting married right in front of me. Fun. All it is.
But you also get to enact those moments. I mean, that part seems cool too. Like you bring the sacred to it. You can create the marriage.
Yeah, my favorite thing about being a chaplain is getting behind the curtain of the idea that like it's all made up. We just like make up rituals, you know? And so it's a surreal moment when people look at you and are like, are we married now? And I'm like, oh, sure. Yeah. Like, right. There's no one moment. There's no one moment for anything, right? Like there's no one moment where you're born slowly. And is it your first breath or is it when your head comes out, right? There's no one moment where you die. Your heart and your brain die at different points. There's no one moment where you're married. Is it when the stamp goes on your marriage certificate, right? And so as a chaplain, being the person who gets to be like, okay, now is another fun sort of mind game of it.
Right. So I'm curious what it was like for you as someone who's such a deep reader of text to write a book.
I love writing. I don't find the process of writing painful. Nor do I find the process of editing painful. I am a big believer in writing really bad first drafts and that most of the writing goes on in the second draft. I loved thinking deeply about quotes. And I exploited everyone I knew. If you and I had a call, I'd be like, I'm working on one about hate. What do you think about hate? And I was just talking to everyone all the time. My friend Matt, poor thing, I would text him at like 2 a.m. being like, what do you think about grief? So it was just it was fun to be in that space. The most painful part of it to me was reading my audiobook because I was reading the final copy of my book and catching things. I was like, wow, that's really poorly worded and it's too late. So that was the really hard part. I also had a very supportive partner who would say, hey, you wanted to get 1,000 words done today, go back to your office. It was a team sport. I think all books are team sports.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. But yeah, it was a lot of fun to just spend time thinking about that.
And now you've created a text that other people can engage with as a sacred text.
Yes, that's frightening. But I guess that is true. I will say, I'm just going to brag. This is my favorite thing that's happened with the book so far. A young woman was reading it on a women's trauma ward at CAMH in Toronto and lent it to another young woman. And I got an email from a social worker that they started passing it around. And so they bought 3 copies for the floor because people were finding it so fulfilling. So like, that's nice.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's the nicest thing that's happened. I don't know why I just bragged like that. No, I was like thinking about the closest thing to treating it as sacred. My wish for the book is that it keeps people company, that it accompanies people and that they feel seen by it and less alone because of it.
Yeah, well, and I think it will also help people learn to do that with a lot of texts and think about reading and companionship and sacredness in different ways. You have this great toolkit at the end of the book, as you mentioned earlier, with some of the traditional tools, some of which are Jewish ones for sacred reading. So can you tell us some of your favorites from there?
My favorite is obviously the Jewish one. Well, there are 2 Jewish ones that I love. Which to pick? I'll do Chavruta because it gets to the heart of reading in community. But this is just like the traditional idea of the way that people study Talmud and yeshiva, right? Which is like 2 people bent over a book. And the idea is, the way that we have sort of codified it and practice it is that if you and I were reading together, I would say, okay, I have a question about Hermione. My question about Hermione, and we just did this one today on our podcast, is in book 1, she's the ultimate rule follower. And in book 2, she starts saying, we'd have to break about 100 school rules, but oh, well, like what happened? Why, right? Was it the troll? What was it that happened? And then also I have to come with an answer. So I was like, so my answer is that she is disappointed in adults and she no longer believes that adults have the answers. And so she feels as though it's all on her now. And my co-reader said, oh, that's interesting. And he sort of explained his thoughts about my answer. And he said, okay, well, I have a question for you then. How does McGonagall feel about the fact that she's disappointed Hermione and has to offer me an answer? And so the idea is that the truth at the heart of these questions is actually in the conversation between us. No one person has an answer. We are going to articulate ourselves better if we are going to have to articulate ourselves to someone who we respect. And our ideas will be expanded upon through the conversation. So only through conversation are we going to come to some sort of nuanced understanding. We ended up having a conversation about, responsibility and forgiveness and betrayal, all wondering why Hermione became a rule breaker.
One of the things I love about Chavruta also is that it's a space where you can also challenge each other. And I think it gets to that piece that you were talking about earlier, I think, in terms of text, that, the text can hold multiple ideas and realities. And sometimes one person can only see one piece of it. But if you're in a trusting relationship around a text and the text becomes part of that relationship, you can see through different eyes and challenge each other to see in different ways. And it's just dialogic in a certain way that I think it's hard with one person in the text.
Yeah. Oh, Matt and I am lucky enough to do the podcast with one of my best friends, and it is the closest to arguing we get, like in a deep way, as Chavruta. Like, how could you say that it's about betrayal, right? But it really gets you to, it makes you check in with your own values and your own presumptions, and it's also so wonderful to have such specific text to talk about, because it keeps the conversation from being about any number of other things, and it stays in the metaphor of the specificity of the text.
I learned a lot from that section of your book also, and loved the idea of, I don't remember what it was called, but the practice of taking, going through a text and pulling the lines that speak to you, and then basically assembling a new text from those lines. And I'm very excited to try that for myself, and also to try it out in sort of educational group settings, because you can create great communal texts out of the things that speak to different people.
Yeah, it's called Floralegia, which just means collection of flowers, like a garden, I think is another word for that. And we do exactly that at the end of our pilgrimages. At the end of every day on a pilgrimage, we have everybody share their sparklet from the day, the sentence that's staying with them. And then at the end of the week, we have them all pick their sparklet of sparklets, the one that's speaking to them the most. And I type them all up, and then we read that as if it's its own text. And it's amazing the things that come from that. It's really beautiful, like a found poem.
Yeah, I love that. Tell us again the name of your pilgrimage tours.
So those are called Common Ground. You can learn about everything I do at our website, notsorryworks.com. But our pilgrimages, I can put it in. But our pilgrimages are called Common Ground, which is from a Virginia Woolf book. Yes, I have the quote right here. I can't show you on my wall.
I was going to say, you have Virginia Woolf just standing next to me.
I have her right off camera. She's feeling shy tonight. The idea is that literature is no one's private ground, it's everyone's common ground. So
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Vanessa, for being with us tonight, for sharing your practice, for reading sacred texts. You've definitely made me think more carefully about how and why I read. And I really loved your book, and need to go back and reread Jane Eyre now.
Yes, always.
Yes, this was wonderful. And thank you all for being with us, for joining our conversation, for all your questions and comments. Tonight was the last QBT of this fall series, but do not fear, we will be back in the winter. And in the meantime, 2 weeks from now, on November 4th at 8 p.m., we hope you will join us for a very special virtual event in honor of JWA's 25th anniversary. We'll be celebrating our founders and our future leaders, our Teen Rising Voices Fellows, and sharing a bit of JWA's history. And we'll also have some exciting visits from Gloria Steinem, from Tova Feldshuh, and Beanie Feldstein. So I hope everyone who's with us tonight will register and celebrate with us. You can find more information on our site, jwa.org/celebrate25. I also wanted to share that we've just begun the fall season of JWA's podcast, Can We Talk? You can find our podcast on our site or wherever you get your podcasts. Our first episode explores an interesting new project to regender the Torah called Torah. And we have another episode featuring the pioneering lesbian photographer Joan Byron coming out next week. So stay tuned for that. And for those of you who love to be with us every week on Thursday nights, we will have another online history course coming in December, which we are planning right now on the topic of Jews and reproductive justice. So stay tuned for that as well. So there will be ample opportunities for us to gather again. It'll be a little while before we have more book programming, but I promise that everything else we have will be great too. So thank you again, Vanessa. And to all of you, it was wonderful to be together. Until next time, be well and take good care.
Thank you, Judith.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.